A cup of coffee became a confession. Mara Delaney's hands trembled as she set the chipped mug before the mechanic whose eyes held storms she recognized from her own mirror. In Cedar Heights, Ohio, rain didn't just fall, it accused, washing nothing clean. Eli Rowan accepted the offering with a nod that carried the weight of galaxies. His grease-stained fingers wrapped around warmth he hadn't allowed himself in 3 years. Across town, Bank President Victor Hale polished his cufflinks for a gala, honoring a ghost, unaware the ghost was bleeding transmission fluid in a diner booth. The past was about to crack open like thunder, subscribe to witness the moment kindness shatters every carefully built lie. The rain against the windows of Mara's diner sounded like fingernails on glass, a relentless percussion that made the fluorescent lights inside seem garish and overexposed, as if the storm was trying to shame everything warm and human into submission. Mara Delaney moved between the booths with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to keep her hands busy, so her mind wouldn't wander into dangerous territories. Her apron stained with coffee rings and pie filling, her dark hair pulled back in a bun that was coming loose at the edges. She was 27, but carried herself with the wariness of someone decades older, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for a blow that never quite landed, but never fully retreated either. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease, a scent so familiar it had become invisible to her, woven into the fabric of her days like a lullaby she'd grown too old to hear. Outside, Cedar Heights, Ohio stretched in all directions, a town built on the bones of manufacturing plants that had closed 2 decades prior, where hope was something people talked about in the past tense. The clock above the register read 6:43 in the evening, and Mara knew without looking that the dinner rush had come and gone, leaving behind only the stragglers and the lonely, those who came not for the food, but for the illusion of companionship that flickered in the neon sign promising home cooking. The door opened with a gust of wind that sent napkins fluttering off tables like startled birds, and Mara looked up to see a man step inside, his frame hunched against the weather, his jacket soaked through so thoroughly it clung to his shoulders like a second skin. He was tall and lean in a way that suggested he'd once been broader, as if grief or time had carved away everything except what was absolutely necessary, and his hair was dark and matted against his forehead, streaked with rain and something darker. Grease, she realized, or oil. His hands were stained black around the fingernails and knuckles, the kind of staining that came from hours spent inside engines and machinery, from work that demanded you get intimate with metal and combustion. He moved to a corner booth without waiting to be seated, his gait stiff as if his body hurt, and when he sat down, Mara noticed the way his eyes swept the diner with a caution that bordered on paranoia, checking exits and windows before settling his gaze on the table in front of him. Those eyes were grey, the colour of winter skies or old stone, and when they briefly met hers, there was something in them that made her breath catch. A kind of exhausted devastation, the look of someone who had survived something they shouldn't have and wasn't entirely grateful for it. She grabbed a menu and a pot of coffee, her feet carrying her across the checkered linoleum before her mind could catch up, because that was what you did in a diner. You offered coffee first and asked questions never. When she reached his table, the smell of engine oil intensified, mixed with rain and something metallic, and up close she could see the dirt ground into the creases of his hands, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his mouth. He looked up at her with those storm-grey eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them stretching taut as a wire about to snap, and Mara felt something shift in her chest. Recognition not of his face, but of the weight he carried, the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible burden she understood too intimately. She set the mug down in front of him and poured without asking, the steam rising between them like a veil, and when she spoke, her voice came out softer than she intended, almost gentle, a tone she hadn't used in years. "Coffee's on the house tonight," she said, and the words surprised her because she wasn't supposed to give anything away for free, not with tips barely covering her rent and the diner owner watching the register like a hawk. He looked at the mug as if she'd set down something dangerous, his jaw tightening, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might stand up and walk back into the rain rather than accept her small mercy. Then his hand moved, fingers wrapping around the ceramic, and he nodded once, a gesture so small and private it felt like a secret. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough and low, scraped raw by something she couldn't name, and Mara felt her own throat tighten in response. She should have walked away then, should have gone back to wiping down tables and refilling ketchup bottles, but instead she found herself lingering, her feet rooted to the linoleum as if the floor had developed gravity. "You work at the garage?" she asked, nodding toward his oil-stained hands, and immediately regretted the question because it was none of her business, because people came to diners to be left alone as much as to be fed. But he didn't seem offended, just tired, his gaze dropping back to the coffee as if it held answers he'd been searching for. "Yeah," he said after a long pause, the word clipped and final, and she understood that was all he was willing to give. She nodded and turned to go, but his voice stopped her, quiet and almost reluctant. "You always give away free coffee." There was no accusation in the question, only a kind of weary curiosity, and Mara felt her face flush, her fingers tightening on the coffee pot handle. "Only when the rain's this bad," she said, which was a lie. She'd never done it before, not once in 3 years of working at the diner. He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to solve an equation, and she saw something flicker there, surprise maybe, or confusion. As if kindness was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric, before she forced herself to walk away, her heart pounding in her chest for reasons she couldn't quite name. Back behind the counter, Mara busied herself with tasks that didn't need doing, scrubbing already clean surfaces and reorganizing the napkin dispensers. But her gaze kept drifting back to the man in the corner booth. He sat hunched over his coffee, both hands wrapped around the mug, as if it were the only warm thing left in the world. And there was something about the set of his shoulders that spoke of a loneliness so profound it had calcified into armor. She knew that posture, had worn it herself for the past 4 years, ever since the night her brother had stolen their mother's savings and disappeared, leaving Mara to pick up the pieces and live with the knowledge that she'd trusted him, had vouched for him, had believed in him right up until the moment he proved how worthless that belief had been. Trust was a currency she no longer trafficked in, a luxury she couldn't afford, and yet here she was, watching a stranger drink free coffee and feeling something dangerous stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but its shadow. The faint outline of what hope used to feel like before betrayal had taught her better. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with renewed fury, and the lights flickered once, twice before steadying. And in that brief darkness, Mara saw the man's silhouette sharp against the window, a figure caught between the warm glow of the diner and the cold chaos of the storm outside. Time moved strangely in diners, especially on nights like this when the rain erased the boundaries between minutes and hours, and Mara lost track of how long the man sat there, nursing his single cup of coffee as if it were the last meal he'd ever have. Other customers came and went, a trucker who ordered pie and left too small a tip, an elderly woman who wanted her soup extra hot and her bread untoasted, a young couple who whispered urgently in a corner booth before leaving without eating, but the mechanic remained, silent and still, a fixed point in the shifting landscape of the diner. Mara refilled his cup twice without asking, each time receiving that same small nod of acknowledgement, and each time she felt the weight of his presence a little more acutely, as if he were pulling gravity toward himself without meaning to. When the clock finally struck 8:30, she realized she'd been watching him for nearly 2 hours. And the realization sent a jolt of alarm through her, because she didn't watch people, didn't let herself get curious, didn't allow strangers to become anything more than temporary occupants of her peripheral vision. But this man with his grease-stained hands and storm-grey eyes had somehow slipped past her defenses, and now she couldn't seem to look away, couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen something in him that mattered, something that would change the shape of her carefully ordered world. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping, and inside, the mechanic named Eli Rowan sat alone with his coffee and his secrets, unaware that across town a bank president was rehearsing a speech that would unravel everything he'd worked so hard to bury. Eli Rowan's hands had learned the language of engines long before they'd forgotten how to build empires, the dialect of pistons and valves becoming a kind of prayer he recited in grease and talk, a penance for the life he'd abandoned when the weight of genius had threatened to crush what remained of his humanity. The garage where he worked occupied a squat brick building on the industrial edge of Cedar Heights, its windows perpetually fogged with condensation and its floor stained with decades of leaked oil that had seeped into the concrete like history no one wanted to remember. He arrived each morning before sunrise, when the sky was still bruised purple and the streets were empty of everything except regret and possibility, and he left long after dark, his muscles aching and his mind blissfully quiet from the repetitive labor of repair. The other mechanics, Hank, with his graying beard and beer gut, Jorge, with his rapid-fire Spanish and quick laugh, treated him with the casual indifference of men who'd seen countless drifters pass through, and Eli preferred it that way, preferred being invisible, being no one, being exactly what he appeared to be, a man who'd made peace with obscurity. But on this particular evening, with the rain hammering the garage's corrugated roof like artillery fire, Eli found himself unable to focus on the transmission spread out on his workbench, its guts exposed and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The coffee from the diner still warmed his belly, an unexpected ember of heat that seemed to spread beyond his physical body into some part of himself he'd thought he'd successfully amputated. The waitress's face kept appearing in his mind, not beautiful in any conventional sense, but striking in the way damaged things often were, her features carved with a weariness that mirrored his own, her dark eyes holding questions she was too polite or too wounded to ask. He'd watched her through the diner window as he'd finally left, seen her moving between tables with mechanical precision, and something about the loneliness in her movements had felt like looking into a mirror. Eli pressed his palms against the workbench and closed his eyes, trying to summon the discipline that had once allowed him to code for 18 hours straight, to see patterns in chaos and build systems from nothing, but all he could see was the way her hands had trembled slightly when she'd poured the coffee, as if the simple act of kindness had cost her something. He wondered what her story was, what had carved those particular shadows under her eyes, and then he hated himself for wondering, because wondering led to caring, and caring led to exposure, and exposure led to the inevitable moment when people looked at you and saw not who you were but what you'd failed to protect. 3 years ago, Eli Rowan had been a different person entirely. Elijah Rowan, founder and chief architect of Axiom Systems, a financial technology company that had revolutionized bank security protocols and made him wealthy beyond any reasonable measure of success. He'd been 30 years old and on the cover of tech magazines, his face everywhere, his ideas reshaping how institutions thought about data protection and algorithmic defense. He'd employed 300 people, held patents worth hundreds of millions, and had been courted by every major firm on the East Coast. But success had come with a price he hadn't anticipated. The constant scrutiny, the way people looked at him not as a human being, but as a commodity, an asset to be leveraged or a threat to be contained. His innovations had saved Cedar Heights First National Bank from a catastrophic breach that would have bankrupted thousands of families, and in gratitude, the bank's board had offered him a seat, a partnership, a future gilded with influence and prestige. He'd stood in the boardroom and looked at the faces around the table, men in expensive suits with expensive watches, their smiles practiced and empty, their eyes calculating his worth in real time. And something inside him had broken. The next day he'd walked away from everything, liquidating his shares, dissolving his company, vanishing so completely that the tech press had spent months speculating about his whereabouts before finally giving up and moving on to the next prodigy. The garage's side door banged open, and Jorge stuck his head in, rain dripping from his hood, his expression apologetic. "Heading out, man," he called over the noise of the storm. "You need anything before I lock up?" Eli shook his head, forcing his attention back to the present, to the solid reality of tools and metal and work that had nothing to do with algorithms or innovation or the suffocating weight of potential. "I'm good," he said, his voice steady, giving nothing away, and Jorge nodded and disappeared, leaving Eli alone with the rain and the exposed transmission and the ghosts that no amount of engine work could fully exorcise. He picked up a wrench and returned to the task at hand, his movements automatic, muscle memory taking over where thought left off. This was why he'd chosen this life, the simplicity of it, the way a broken thing could be diagnosed and fixed without ambiguity, without the moral complexity that had plagued his previous existence. An engine either ran or it didn't. There were no board meetings, no ethical quandaries, no moments when you had to decide whether your innovation would be used to help people or exploit them. There was only the work, clean and finite and blessedly meaningless beyond its immediate utility. But tonight, the work felt different, contaminated somehow by the memory of the waitress's kindness, by the way she'd looked at him, as if he were simply a tired man in need of coffee, rather than a ghost haunting his own abandoned life. Eli set down the wrench and wiped his hands on a rag that was already saturated with grease, his mind drifting back to the moment he'd made his decision to disappear. It hadn't been dramatic or public, no manifesto, no press conference, no grand denouncement of the system that had built him up and then tried to devour him. He'd simply walked away, quietly and completely, taking nothing with him except the clothes on his back and a bank account substantial enough to survive on if he lived modestly. He'd chosen Cedar Heights specifically because it was the last place anyone would look for him, a town economically depressed enough that no one asked too many questions about your past or your credentials, where a man could get work with his hands and be judged solely on whether he showed up on time and did the job competently. For 3 years, the strategy had worked flawlessly. He'd been invisible, anonymous, free from the prison of his former identity. But the waitress's simple gesture had cracked something open inside him, had reminded him that invisibility came with its own costs, that hiding was a kind of slow suffocation even when it felt like safety. The rain continued its assault on the garage roof, and Eli found himself thinking about the gala that Victor Hale had been planning for months, the one honoring an anonymous donor who'd saved the bank years ago. He'd read about it in the local paper, seen the promotional posters around town, and each time he'd felt a cold twist of anxiety in his gut because he knew exactly who that anonymous donor was, knew that Victor Hale had never stopped looking for Elijah Rowan, never stopped trying to find the man who'd vanished after performing what Victor considered a miracle. The bank president was persistent and meticulous, qualities that had made him successful and that now made him dangerous to Eli's carefully constructed anonymity. There was always the risk that Victor would eventually piece together the truth, would recognize the mechanic with the grease-stained hands as the prodigy who'd once saved his institution, and Eli had spent 3 years preparing for that possibility, planning his next disappearance, ready to abandon Cedar Heights the moment his cover was compromised. But tonight, with the taste of free coffee still on his tongue and the memory of the waitress's wounded eyes in his mind, the thought of running again felt unbearable, as if he'd used up all his capacity for erasure and reinvention. He looked down at his hands, black with engine oil, scarred from burns and cuts, transformed by labor into something unrecognizable from the smooth fingers that had once flown across keyboards, and wondered if transformation was the same thing as escape, or if he'd simply traded one kind of prison for another, more honest one. Victor Hale stood before the floor-length mirror in his office at Cedar Heights First National Bank and adjusted his tie for the third time, his fingers trembling slightly despite his best efforts at composure, because tonight's gala was not simply a fundraiser or a social obligation, but the culmination of a 3-year obsession that had consumed his nights and haunted his professional conscience. He was 52 years old and looked a decade younger thanks to careful grooming and expensive suits. His silver hair swept back from a face that had learned to project authority even when he felt none, his posture rigid with the kind of discipline that came from years of managing other people's money and other people's trust. The office around him was all polished wood and leather, windows overlooking Main Street where streetlights glowed through the persistent rain, and on his desk sat the speech he'd written and rewritten 17 times, each draft an attempt to capture gratitude for a man whose name he didn't know and whose face he'd only glimpsed once, years ago, in a moment of crisis that had nearly destroyed everything Victor had built. The bank president moved to his desk and picked up the framed photograph that sat beside his computer. His wife, Linda, his 2 daughters both grown and living on opposite coasts, their smiles frozen in a moment of happiness that felt increasingly distant from his current reality. The truth that Victor carried like a stone in his chest was that Cedar Heights First National had been hours from collapse when Elijah Rowan had appeared with his revolutionary security protocol, a system so sophisticated it had not only stopped the breach, but had set new industry standards that other institutions paid millions to license. The attack had come from overseas, a coordinated assault designed to drain every account and leave thousands of families financially ruined. And Victor had watched it unfold on his computer screens with the helpless horror of a man witnessing a murder he was powerless to prevent. Then Elijah Rowan had walked into his office, young, intense, his eyes blazing with the kind of focused intelligence that made Victor feel suddenly old and obsolete. And within 6 hours, the breach had been contained, the attackers repelled, the funds secured. Victor had tried to thank him, had offered him everything the bank could afford, money, partnership, recognition. But Elijah had refused it all, accepting only a modest consulting fee and an agreement that his role would remain anonymous. And then, less than a month later, he disappeared completely, his company dissolved, his presence erased from the tech world as if he'd never existed, leaving Victor with an unpaid debt that grew heavier with each passing year. Tonight's gala was Victor's attempt to finally honor that debt publicly, even if he couldn't name the man he was honoring, and the irony wasn't lost on him that he was throwing a party for a ghost, raising funds for community programs in the name of someone who'd deliberately chosen invisibility over acclaim. He'd hired investigators over the years, had followed every lead and rumor about Elijah Rowan's whereabouts, but each trail had gone cold, as if the young genius had mastered the art of disappearance with the same brilliance he'd once applied to code and systems. Victor sometimes wondered if Elijah was even still alive, if the pressure of his genius had consumed him the way it consumed so many prodigies, burning bright and fast before collapsing into darkness. But something in Victor refused to believe that. Some instinct insisted that Elijah Rowan was out there somewhere, watching and waiting, perhaps regretting his decision to vanish, but unable to find his way back. The bank president moved to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked street, at the few pedestrians hurrying past with umbrellas bent against the wind, and he felt the weight of the evening ahead pressing down on his shoulders like accumulated debt. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her efficiency a small comfort in the chaos of his thoughts. "The caterers are set up," she said, tablet in hand, her voice brisk and professional. "Guest list is confirmed at 237, and the mayor's office called to confirm he'll be speaking briefly before your presentation." Victor nodded, forcing his mind back to logistics, to the 1,000 details that required his attention and approval. The gala would take place in the bank's restored main hall, a space built in the 1920s with soaring ceilings and marble columns, a monument to an era when banks were temples of prosperity and trust rather than targets for digital predators. He'd poured weeks into planning the event, personally approving everything from the menu to the flower arrangements, because this night mattered in ways that transcended fundraising or public relations. It was his way of saying that some debts couldn't be measured in money, that gratitude sometimes demanded grand gestures, even when the recipient would never see them. His assistant left, and Victor returned to his desk, picking up the speech again, his eyes scanning words that suddenly felt inadequate to capture what he needed to express. The bank had thrived in the years since Elijah's intervention, growing its customer base and expanding its services, becoming a cornerstone of Cedar Heights' modest economic revival. And every quarter, when Victor reviewed the numbers, he thought about the young man who'd made it possible, who'd saved them, and then refused to be saved himself. There was something tragic in that, something that resonated with Victor's own understanding of how burdens could become identities, how the act of rescuing others could leave you feeling more lost than before. He'd seen it in Elijah's eyes that day in his office, not just intelligence, but a kind of weary sadness, as if success had already taught him lessons he wished he'd never learned. Victor wondered if that was why Elijah had run. If the weight of being extraordinary had become unbearable, if anonymity was the only refuge left for someone whose gifts had made them a target. The thought made him angry, not at Elijah but at the world that had made such an escape necessary, at the systems and institutions that consumed their brightest minds and discarded them when they broke. Tonight's gala was meant to honor Elijah, but Victor knew it was also meant to indict that system, to say that gratitude mattered, that recognition shouldn't require exploitation, that human beings were more than their utility. The rain intensified, and Victor checked his watch. 3 hours until guests would begin arriving. 3 hours until he would stand before Cedar Heights elite and speak about a man whose absence was more powerful than most people's presence. He thought about calling his wife, about sharing his nervousness and his doubts, but Linda had heard this story too many times, had listened to his obsession with patient weariness, and he couldn't burden her again with anxieties she couldn't relieve. Instead, he gathered his papers and his resolve and prepared to leave for the venue, to oversee the final preparations and ensure that everything was perfect for an honoree who would never attend, who might never even know that tonight was happening. As he locked his office and walked through the bank's quiet corridors, past teller stations and vault doors and all the machinery of commerce that Elijah Rowan had saved, Victor Hale allowed himself a moment of hope that somehow, impossibly, Elijah would hear about tonight, would understand that he was remembered and valued, would know that his sacrifice hadn't been forgotten, even if his name remained unspoken. The hope was irrational and probably futile, but Victor clung to it anyway, because hope was what kept you human when duty threatened to make you mechanical. And tonight, more than ever, he needed to believe that human connection could transcend distance and time, and the deliberate erasure of identity. Mara Delaney's shift ended at 10, but she stayed an extra hour to help close, partly because the diner owner was short-staffed, and partly because going home to her empty apartment felt less appealing than wiping down tables and counting register receipts in the fluorescent hum of the dining room. Her feet ached and her back hurt, and there was a grease stain on her uniform that wouldn't come out no matter how many times she washed it. But she moved through the closing routine with mechanical precision, muscle memory compensating for the exhaustion that had seeped into her bones. The mechanic had left around 9, slipping out into the rain without saying goodbye, and Mara had felt his absence more acutely than his presence, as if he'd taken some essential warmth with him when he'd gone. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that he was just another customer, and she'd given away free coffee on impulse, nothing more. But the rationalization felt hollow because something had passed between them in those silent moments, some recognition that transcended words and circumstances, and now she couldn't stop thinking about his storm-grey eyes and the way his hands had gripped the coffee mug as if it were a lifeline. When she finally locked up and stepped into the rain-soaked parking lot, the night air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp and unforgiving, and Mara pulled her jacket tighter as she walked to her car, a battered Honda with rust spots and a passenger door that stuck. The drive home took 15 minutes through streets empty of everything except rain and streetlights, reflecting off wet pavement, and she used the time to run through the familiar litany of her failures. The internal accounting she performed most nights when silence gave her thoughts room to spread. She was 27 and going nowhere, trapped in a job that paid minimum wage, plus tips that barely covered rent, living in a town that had been dying since before she was born. Her mother lived in a nursing home 2 counties away, dementia having erased most of her memory, including the betrayal that had bankrupted her. And Mara visited twice a month to sit beside her bed and hold her hand and pretend that everything was fine. Her brother hadn't called in 4 years, not since the night he'd stolen their mother's savings and disappeared, and Mara had long since stopped expecting closure or apology or any kind of reckoning. She'd learned that some debts never got paid and some wounds never healed, and the only choice was to keep moving forward with whatever pieces remained. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, the stairwell smelling of mildew and old cooking oil, the walls thin enough that she could hear her neighbors arguing through the plaster. She unlocked her door and stepped into the small space she'd managed to make almost comfortable. A futon that doubled as a couch, a kitchenette with a hot plate and a mini-fridge, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, everything clean but shabby, worn down by time and insufficient resources. Mara dropped her bag by the door and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-blurred lights of Cedar Heights spread below, and she felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her like a weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying. She'd had friends once, relationships, a life that felt like it might be building toward something meaningful, but the betrayal had changed her in ways she was still discovering, had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, and that the safest way to live was alone. People let you down eventually. Her brother had proven that conclusively, and the only way to avoid the pain of abandonment was to never let anyone close enough to leave. But tonight, the loneliness felt different, sharper somehow, cutting deeper than usual, and Mara realized with a start that it had something to do with the mechanic, with the way his presence had disrupted her carefully maintained emotional distance. She'd given him free coffee, and in that simple gesture had violated her own rules about staying separate, staying safe, staying protected from the dangers of human connection. The thought made her angry at herself, at her weakness, at the part of her that still believed kindness mattered despite all evidence to the contrary. She moved to her kitchenette and poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the anxiety that threatened to spiral into full panic. This was why she kept people at a distance, because even the smallest opening could become a wound, Because compassion was a door that swung both ways, and you never knew what might come through it until it was too late to close. The mechanic would forget about her by tomorrow, would probably never return to the diner, and she'd go back to serving customers with practiced indifference, keeping everyone at arm's length where they belonged. Except she couldn't quite convince herself of that, because there had been something in his eyes that suggested he understood what it meant to hide, to carry damage so profound it shaped every interaction, to live as if the past was a predator you had to stay one step ahead of. Mara sat on her futon and pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture of self-protection that had become habitual. And she let herself remember the moment her brother had asked to borrow money. How earnest he'd seemed, how convincing his promises had been. She'd believed him because that's what sisters did, because family was supposed to mean something, because she'd needed to believe that the bond between them was stronger than his addiction and his lies. And when he'd taken everything and vanished, she'd blamed herself. Had spent months dissecting every conversation, looking for signs she should have seen, clues she should have caught, ways she could have prevented the devastation. The guilt had nearly destroyed her, had left her hollowed out and mistrustful, convinced that her judgment was fatally flawed, and that anyone who seemed to need help was really just looking for someone to exploit. The rain hammered against her window, and Mara closed her eyes, trying to quiet the thoughts that circled like vultures, trying to find some path through the maze of her own damage. Tomorrow night was the gala at Cedar Heights First National, an event the whole town had been talking about for weeks, and she'd considered going just to break the monotony of her routine, to dress in the one nice outfit she owned and spend a few hours pretending to be someone different, someone whole. But the thought of being surrounded by all those successful people, all that polish and confidence, made her feel exhausted before she'd even begun. She didn't belong in spaces like that, didn't know how to make small talk or network or project the kind of easy competence that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. She belonged in diners and empty apartments, in the margins of society where failure wasn't remarked upon because everyone was failing together. And yet some stubborn part of her wanted to go, wanted to prove that she was more than her circumstances, that the betrayal hadn't completely broken her, that she could still participate in the world even if she couldn't quite believe in it. She didn't decide that night, just let the question hang in the rain-soaked darkness, another choice postponed, another risk deferred. Another day survived in the slow, grinding machinery of her carefully limited life. The gala began at 7 with champagne and murmured conversations. The bank's main hall transformed into something that transcended its utilitarian architecture. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light across marble floors that gleamed like still water. Victor Hale moved through the crowd with practiced grace, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on an event that felt increasingly surreal as the evening progressed, his mind only half present to the small talk and pleasantries that formed the social scaffolding of such occasions. The guest list represented Cedar Heights' modest elite, local business owners, city council members, a handful of regional politicians who'd made the drive for the free food and photo opportunities, and Victor played his role with the efficiency of long practice, all charm and confidence, while his thoughts circled obsessively around the speech he would give in an hour, the words that would honor a man who couldn't hear them. He spotted Mara Delaney near the refreshment table and felt a flicker of surprise because she seemed so thoroughly out of place here, her dress simple and inexpensive next to the designer labels around her, her posture defensive as if she expected to be challenged on her right to occupy this space, and something about her discomfort resonated with Victor in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Mara had come on impulse, had pulled her one decent black dress from the back of her closet and done her makeup in the cracked mirror of her bathroom, telling herself that she had as much right to be here as anyone, that the gala was open to the community, and she was part of this community, whether she felt like it or not. But now that she'd arrived, the confidence that had carried her through the door was evaporating rapidly, replaced by a bone-deep certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake, that everyone could see through her attempt at belonging and recognized her for the fraud she was. She took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and sipped it without tasting, her eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces and finding none, surrounded by strangers who moved with the easy assurance of people who'd never questioned their place in the world. She thought about leaving, about slipping back out into the rain and returning to her apartment, where at least her failure was private, but something stubborn in her refused to retreat, refused to let the betrayal and the damage win so completely that she couldn't even attend a public event without running away. The doors at the back of the hall opened, and Eli Rowan stepped inside, his presence so unexpected and incongruous that several conversations died mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the man in oil-stained work clothes who'd just entered their carefully curated evening. He'd come because something had broken in him after he'd left the diner, some final defense against his own isolation, and he'd spent hours walking through the rain, trying to convince himself that showing up at the gala was insane, that it risked everything he'd built in 3 years of careful anonymity. But the memory of Mara's kindness had refused to leave him alone, had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter working its way toward his heart, and he'd realized that hiding had become its own kind of prison, that safety purchased at the cost of all human connection was just another form of death. So he'd walked to the bank in his work clothes, still smelling of engine oil, his hair plastered to his skull by rain, and he'd pushed through those doors, knowing that everything was about to change, and unable to stop himself, because the alternative, continuing to live as a ghost, haunting his own life, had become unbearable. Victor Hale saw him first, his trained banker's eye catching the movement at the entrance, and for a moment his brain couldn't process what he was seeing because the figure standing there bore no resemblance to any expected guest. Then their eyes met across the crowded hall, and Victor felt the world tilt sideways, felt recognition slam into him with the force of physical impact, because despite the years and the dirt and the deliberate disguise, those eyes were unmistakable, storm grey and devastatingly intelligent, the eyes of Elijah Rowan, who'd saved his bank and then vanished like smoke. Victor's champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the sound cutting through the murmur of conversation like a gunshot. And suddenly every eye in the hall was either on him or on the mechanic standing in the doorway. And the moment stretched taut between them, pregnant with implications that were spreading through the crowd like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Victor moved forward without conscious decision, his feet carrying him across the space that separated them, and when he reached Eli, he stopped just close enough to speak without being overheard, his voice shaking with emotion he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "It's you," Victor said, and the words came out broken, barely more than a whisper, weighted with 3 years of searching and wondering and hoping. "My God, it's really you." Eli met his gaze and nodded once, the gesture heavy with resignation and something that might have been relief. And when he spoke, his voice carried the rough exhaustion of a man who'd reached the end of his capacity for running. "I'm sorry," he said, though what exactly he was apologizing for remained unclear. For disappearing, or for returning, or simply for existing in a way that complicated everyone's carefully constructed narratives. Victor shook his head, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and the hall around them had gone completely silent, 200 people frozen in place as they witnessed a reunion whose significance they couldn't yet comprehend. Mara stood near the refreshment table and watched the exchange with growing confusion that curdled into understanding as she recognized the mechanic from her diner. Saw him standing there in his work clothes, surrounded by Cedar Heights elite, and something in her chest cracked open at the realization that the man she'd offered free coffee to was at the center of whatever drama was unfolding. Victor turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the trained projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention, and what he said next would later be repeated and analyzed and dissected by everyone who was present. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his hands shaking as he gestured toward Eli, "the man we've gathered to honor tonight, the anonymous donor whose brilliance saved this bank and this community, he's here." The words hung in the air like smoke, and the crowd erupted into confused murmuring, people looking at each other and then back at Eli, trying to reconcile the grease-stained mechanic with the genius they'd been prepared to celebrate in abstract. Victor continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "This is Elijah Rowan, founder of Axiom Systems, the person whose intervention 3 years ago prevented a catastrophic breach that would have destroyed thousands of lives. He chose anonymity then, and apparently has been living among us ever since. And I—" His voice broke and he had to pause, collecting himself before finishing. "I had stopped believing I'd ever get the chance to thank him publicly." Eli stood in the center of the hall's attention and felt the weight of every gaze, like a physical pressure against his skin, felt his carefully constructed anonymity dissolving in real time, and the panic he'd been holding at bay threatened to overwhelm him. He'd known this moment would be difficult, but hadn't anticipated the sheer claustrophobic intensity of being seen again, of having his identity reassembled in public after 3 years of dismantling it piece by piece. He looked for an exit, for any escape route that wouldn't involve pushing through the crowd, and his eyes found Mara standing 20 feet away, her expression a complex mixture of shock and something else. Hurt, maybe, or betrayal, as if his hidden identity was a personal affront. Their gazes locked and held, and in that moment Eli saw his own damage reflected back at him. Recognized in her eyes the same wariness and mistrust that had driven him into exile, and he understood with sudden clarity that whatever happened next would determine not just his own fate, but hers as well, because somehow, in the space of a few hours, she'd become tangled in the wreckage of his attempt at reinvention. Mara Delaney felt the walls of the bank's hall closing in, as if the air itself had thickened into something unbreathable, her champagne glass trembling in her hand as she processed the revelation that the man she'd offered free coffee to was not simply a mechanic, but someone important, someone hidden, someone who'd lied by omission in a way that felt sickeningly familiar. The betrayal wasn't rational. He owed her nothing, had made no promises, had simply accepted her small kindness without explaining his history. But rationality had no power over the wound that opened in her chest, the old injury tearing fresh as she realized that once again she'd trusted someone without knowing who they really were. The crowd surged forward around Eli, people wanting to shake his hand or touch his shoulder, or simply be near the unexpected celebrity that had materialized in their midst, and Mara watched him endure the attention with visible discomfort, his body rigid and his jaw clenched, as if he were being assaulted rather than celebrated. She wanted to leave, to escape this space that had become a theater of exposure and recognition, but her feet wouldn't move and she stood rooted to the spot, watching the drama unfold with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a disaster they couldn't prevent. Victor Hale was speaking again, his voice cutting through the crowd's excited murmuring, explaining in broad strokes what Elijah Rowan had done years ago and why his presence tonight was significant. And with each sentence, Mara felt her understanding shift and recalibrate. The mechanic wasn't simply hiding. He was a genius who'd walked away from everything, who'd chosen obscurity over acclaim, who'd been living in Cedar Heights disguised as exactly what he appeared to be. The revelation should have made her angry or vindicated or something simple and clean, but instead she felt a confusing tangle of emotions that refused to resolve into any single coherent response. Part of her recognized the courage it must have taken to abandon that level of success, to deliberately unmake yourself and start over with nothing but your hands and your willingness to work. But another part, the part still scarred by her brother's betrayal, saw only another person who'd hidden the truth. Another situation where she'd been the naive fool who didn't see what was right in front of her. The parallel wasn't fair, but it was persistent, and Mara felt tears burning behind her eyes as the familiar shame of having been fooled washed over her in cold waves. Eli finally broke free from the crowd and moved toward the exit, his movements desperate now, the social obligation having overwhelmed whatever impulse had brought him here in the first place, and Mara found herself moving to intercept him without conscious decision. They met near the doors, and for a moment neither spoke, the space between them charged with unspoken questions and accusations. And when Mara finally found her voice, it came out harder than she intended, sharpened by hurt she hadn't known she was capable of feeling for a stranger. "You let me give you free coffee," she said, and the words sounded ridiculous even as she spoke them. But they contained a larger truth about compassion offered under false pretenses, about the asymmetry of knowledge that made kindness feel like condescension in retrospect. Eli looked at her with those storm-grey eyes, and she saw real pain there. Not the practiced remorse of someone caught in a lie, but genuine anguish. And when he responded, his voice was rough with exhaustion. "I didn't ask for it," he said, which was true, but also inadequate. A defense that acknowledged the facts without addressing the feeling beneath them. They stared at each other while the gala continued around them. Victor Hale's voice rising and falling in the background as he tried to regain control of the evening's narrative, and Mara felt something shift in her chest, some internal calculation recalibrating as she looked at Eli's oil-stained clothes and tired face, and recognized that whatever he was hiding from, it wasn't her. His disguise wasn't personal, wasn't aimed at deceiving any individual, but rather at protecting himself from something larger and more complicated than she'd initially understood. The realization didn't erase her hurt, but it complicated it, added layers that made simple anger impossible to sustain. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked, her voice softer now, genuinely curious rather than accusatory, and Eli's shoulders sagged, as if the question had cut through his last defense. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in his confusion was somehow more convincing than any practiced explanation would have been. "I've been hiding for 3 years, and tonight I just couldn't anymore. The coffee you gave me made me remember what it felt like to be seen as human rather than as potential or threat or commodity, and I wanted—" He stopped, struggling for words, and Mara found herself leaning in slightly, waiting for him to finish. "I wanted to remember what it was like to exist in public," Eli continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, intimate despite the crowd around them. "To be someone real, instead of someone erased. But I think I forgot how to do it, forgot how to be Elijah Rowan, instead of just Eli the mechanic. And now I'm standing here, and I can feel the old life trying to reclaim me, and I don't know if I have the strength to disappear again, or if I even want to." The vulnerability in his admission was startling, raw in a way that bypassed Mara's defenses and struck something deep in her own understanding of what it meant to live in exile from yourself. She'd been doing the same thing since her brother's betrayal, hiding not from the world, but from her own capacity for trust, protecting herself so thoroughly that protection had become indistinguishable from imprisonment. They were both ghosts, she realized, both people who'd chosen invisibility over risk, and the recognition created an unexpected sympathy that bridged the gap her hurt had opened. "I understand," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it, that somewhere in the last few minutes her anger had transmuted into something more complicated and more generous. Victor Hale appeared at Eli's shoulder, his expression a mixture of joy and concern. And behind him the crowd was still watching, still waiting to see what would happen next in this unexpected drama. "Elijah," Victor said, his voice gentle now, almost pleading, "please don't run again. Whatever you need, whatever support we can provide, I'm asking you to stay and let us help you come back." Eli looked from Victor to Mara and then back to the crowd that had gathered to honor him. And Mara saw the moment of decision play across his features, like weather, fear and hope and resignation all cycling through in rapid succession before settling into something that looked like tentative courage. He started, then stopped, recalibrating. "I need time to figure out what coming back even means. I'm not the person I was 3 years ago, and I'm not sure I want to be that person again. The work I do now is simple, and it's mine, and no one expects anything from me except showing up on time and fixing what's broken. That matters to me in ways I can't explain to people who've never needed to disappear." Victor nodded slowly, his banker's mind already adjusting to this new information, trying to find a path that would satisfy both the community's desire for recognition and Eli's need for autonomy. "Then we honor that," he said, his voice firm with decision. "We honor you in whatever way you're comfortable with. If you want anonymity, we maintain it. If you want acknowledgement, we provide it. But please—" And here his voice broke again, revealing the emotion beneath his professional composure. "Please know that you're valued here, not for what you can build or what you can provide, but because you're part of this community and you saved us when we needed saving, and that matters regardless of whether you want credit for it." The words seemed to reach Eli through whatever armor he'd constructed, and Mara saw his eyes shine with unshed tears, saw the cost of his years of isolation written in the lines of his face, and she felt something in her own chest unlock, some door she'd kept barricaded swinging open despite her better judgment. Without planning to, without thinking it through, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers closing around his grease-stained knuckles in a gesture that was both comfort and solidarity, a statement that whatever happened next, they were somehow in it together, even though they barely knew each other. The aftermath of revelation came not as explosion, but as slow dissolution, the gala continuing around them, while Eli and Mara stood near the doors, locked in their private conversation. Victor Hale orchestrating damage control with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing crises. The crowd's initial shock had mellowed into excited speculation, people clustering in small groups to dissect what they'd witnessed and debate what it meant for Cedar Heights to have a hidden genius living among them, disguised as a mechanic. Victor gave a modified version of his planned speech, pivoting smoothly to accommodate the unexpected presence of his honoree, praising Elijah Rowan's contributions without demanding he step forward or claim the spotlight, allowing him the dignity of recognition without the prison of obligation. And through it all, Eli remained near the exit, holding Mara's hand, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the present moment, his face pale but determined, his body language suggesting a man standing at a crossroads, trying to decide which direction led towards something resembling redemption. When the formal program ended and the crowd began to disperse into smaller conversations, Victor approached them again with a proposal that had clearly been forming throughout the evening. "I know you need space," he said to Eli, his tone careful and respectful of the boundaries that had been established. "But there are practical matters we should discuss, your old patents, the licensing agreements that are still generating revenue in your name, legal protections we can put in place if you're worried about unwanted attention. I'd like to help you navigate whatever comes next, not as your employer or your beneficiary, but as someone who understands what it's like to carry responsibility that feels heavier than any reward. Eli listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when he finally responded, his voice carried a weariness that spoke to years of carrying burdens alone. "I'll need time to think about all of that," he said. "Right now, I barely know who I am or what I want. The person who walked away 3 years ago did it because the weight of being Elijah Rowan was crushing him, and I'm not sure I'm ready to pick that weight back up, even in a modified form." Mara squeezed his hand and spoke before she could second-guess herself, her voice steady despite her internal turbulence. "Maybe the question isn't about being Elijah Rowan or Eli the mechanic," she said. "Maybe it's about figuring out who you are now that you've lived both lives. About integrating instead of choosing." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, because they applied as much to her own situation as to his. She, too, had been living in pieces, the betrayed sister who'd withdrawn from the world, never quite managing to become someone whole and forward-looking. Eli looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, a softening that suggested her words had landed with unexpected force. "How do you do that?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not rhetorical. An actual request for guidance from someone who seemed to have her own experience with fragmentation. Mara almost laughed at the irony of him asking her for wisdom about integration when she'd spent 4 years hiding in her own way. But instead, she found herself answering honestly. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I've been hiding too, just from different things. But maybe we could figure it out together." The proposal hung between them, tentative and fragile, a possibility rather than a promise, and Eli nodded slowly, as if considering whether he was capable of accepting help, whether the risk of connection was worth the potential reward of moving forward. Victor watched them with an expression that suggested he understood he was witnessing something more significant than a business negotiation, and when he spoke again, his voice carried genuine warmth. "Whatever you decide," he said to Eli, "know that this community values you for more than your technical brilliance. You've been here 3 years, working an honest job, showing up every day, contributing in quiet ways that matter. That's worth honoring regardless of your past accomplishments." The words seemed to affect Eli deeply, his jaw tightening with emotion, and Mara felt him grip her hand more tightly, as if anchoring himself against the tide of recognition that threatened to sweep him away. They stood that way for a long moment while the gala wound down around them, staff beginning to clear tables and guests filtering toward the exits, the evening's drama settling into memory and story. Eventually, they walked together through the rain-washed streets of Cedar Heights, an unlikely trio bound by crisis and revelation, Victor Hale in his expensive suit, Mara Delaney in her simple black dress, and Eli Rowan, still wearing his grease-stained work clothes. They talked as they walked, sharing pieces of their histories that helped explain how they'd arrived at this particular intersection, and with each story, the distance between them decreased incrementally, stranger becoming acquaintance, becoming something closer to understanding. Victor spoke about the pressure of managing an institution on which thousands of families depended, the way success created its own prison of expectations and obligations. Mara talked about her brother's betrayal and her mother's dementia, and the 4 years she'd spent learning to trust nothing and no one. And Eli, halting and uncertain at first, but gaining confidence as he went, described the suffocation of being a prodigy, the way his intelligence had made him valuable, but not quite human in other people's eyes, a tool to be used rather than a person to be known. The rain continued falling, and they walked through it without seeking shelter, letting themselves get soaked, and somehow the physical discomfort made the emotional vulnerability feel more tolerable. By the time they reached Mara's building, The sky had begun to lighten toward dawn, the rain diminishing to a fine mist that clung to everything like blessing or absolution. They stood on the sidewalk outside her apartment, and the moments stretched between them, weighted with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Victor excused himself with a promise to call Eli in a few days, leaving him and Mara alone in the grey pre-dawn light. And when Victor was gone, they looked at each other with the strange intimacy of people who'd been through something transformative together. "I meant what I said about figuring things out together," Mara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know what that looks like or how it works, but I know I don't want to keep living the way I've been living, always afraid, always protecting myself from imaginary threats. Your courage tonight, showing up even though it terrified you, that reminded me that hiding is its own kind of death." Eli nodded, his exhaustion visible in every line of his body, but his eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "I'm not sure I have any courage left," he admitted. "Tonight used up whatever reserves I'd been hoarding, but if you're willing to try this thing, whatever it is, then maybe I can too." They exchanged phone numbers in the slow, careful way of people who knew how much weight a small gesture could carry, and when Mara finally went inside, Eli stood on the sidewalk watching her building as the sun broke through the clouds, its light transforming the rain-soaked street into something briefly beautiful. He thought about the garage waiting for him, the engines he'd promised to repair, the simple, reliable work that had sustained him through 3 years of exile. He thought about Victor's offer to help navigate the practical complications of his revealed identity, about lawyers and patents, and the machinery of institutional recognition that he'd fled years ago. And he thought about Mara's willingness to extend trust despite her own wounds. Her offer to build something together out of their shared damage and hesitant courage. The future was uncertain. He might still need to disappear again, might find that Cedar Heights couldn't contain both his history and his present, might discover that integration was impossible, and he'd have to choose between the genius and the mechanic after all. But standing there in the dawn light, watching the city wake around him, Eli Rowan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a third option. Not Elijah the founder or Eli the mechanic, but someone new and whole. Someone who could acknowledge both lives without being imprisoned by either. He turned and walked toward the garage as the sun climbed higher, his grease-stained hands thrust in his pockets, his step lighter than it had been in years, carrying within him the fragile seed of hope that sometimes the courage to be seen was the first step toward being fully alive.